Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Have you ever looked at a random pattern like clouds or the texture on a wall, and suddenly seen a face staring back at you? It is a common trick our brains play, called face pareidolia. And in this new study, scientists are asking if these imaginary faces mess with our memories. So we all know that things like how big an image is or how clear it is can affect how well we remember it. But what about when our brain thinks it sees something that isn't really there? That is where this research dives in. The scientists here were curious if seeing a face in, say, the front of a car would make us remember that car image better, or even trick us into thinking we'd seen it before when we actually hadn't. The core idea is this phantom face phenomenon, or face pareidolia. It's super common. Think of seeing faces in toast or electrical outlets. Our brains are wired to find faces, and sometimes they find them where there are none. The researchers thought these illusory faces might grab our attention more because they're surprising and interesting. This could lead to us paying more attention to them, and maybe remembering them better. They even wondered if the brain uses the same special areas to process these fake faces as it does for real ones, which might boost memory. To figure this out, they conducted a few experiments with quite a few people, over 200 in total. In one main experiment, they showed participants different kinds of images. Some were real faces, some were outdoor scenes, and then there were the special illusory face images. For each illusory face image, they also had a control image that looked very similar in content and style, but didn't have that face-like quality. They asked people to just look at these images, not knowing they'd be tested later. Then, in a surprise memory test, they showed them a mix of images they'd seen before and completely new ones, and asked them to say old or new. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. You might expect that seeing a face, even an illusory one, would make you remember it better. But surprisingly, the actual memory sensitivity, meaning how well people could tell the difference between images they'd seen and ones they hadn't, wasn't consistently better for these illusory faces. It wasn't that they remembered the illusory faces more accurately in terms of distinguishing them from new items. However, something else was going on, the decision criterion. Think of this like your personal bar for saying, "I saw this before." Some people have a high bar they need to be really sure before they say yes. Others have a low bar, or a more liberal criterion, and they're more likely to say yes, even if they're not completely certain. What they found was that for illusory faces, people had a more liberal decision criterion. This means they were more likely to say they had seen an illusory face image, even if their actual ability to distinguish it from a new image wasn't that much better. Even cooler, this effect of a lower decision criterion, meaning being quicker to say yes, I saw, that got stronger with how clear the illusory face was. The more strongly people perceived a face in an image, the more likely they were to report having seen it, regardless of whether they actually had. To make sure this wasn't just about people being generally liberal when looking at these images, they did another experiment, using a different type of memory test called a 2 alternative force choice, or 2AFC. In this version, they'd show people two images side by side and ask them to pick the one they remembered seeing. Crucially, in some of these tests, they showed two new images and asked people to pick which one they'd seen before. This is a clever way to see if people will falsely pick an illusory face, even when they haven't seen either image. And guess what? People still tended to pick the illusory face images more often. They were more likely to say they'd seen an illusory face even when it was completely new compared to other types of new images. Now, does this mean they genuinely remembered seeing these faces, or was it something else? They dug deeper by asking people how sure they were about their memory choices. And this is where it gets really nuanced. They found that when people falsely reported seeing an illusory face in those two new images tests, their confidence wasn't sky high. It was moderate, and actually a bit lower than when they correctly remembered the real image. This suggests it might not be a strong, vivid false memory, but more like a feeling of familiarity, that it feels like they've encountered it before, even if the details aren't clear or the memory isn't solid. This is like a fuzzy, vague sense of having seen it, rather than a clear recall. So what's the big takeaway? The scientists believe that these illusory faces don't necessarily make our memory for the actual image stronger or weaker, but what they do seem to do is influence our decision at the time of the memory test. They create this sense of familiarity, or a lower threshold for saying yes, which makes us more likely to report remembering them, even when we haven't actually seen them. It is like the phantom face adds a little nudge to our memory judgment, making us lean towards saying we've seen it without necessarily creating a strong, accurate memory trace. This kind of research is super important because it shows how our perception and our memory are deeply intertwined, and how even subtle subjective experiences, like seeing a face that isn't there, can impact our quite objective reports about what we remember. It highlights that memory isn't just a perfect recording device. It is an active process that can be nudged and influenced by how we perceive the world. What's great about this study is that they used multiple experiments to really nail down their findings. They looked at different types of memory tests, and even tested how varying faceness of the illusion changed things. They also compared human memory to how an AI program remembers images, which is a cool way to see if machines can capture what makes things memorable for us. They found AI and humans agreed on some things, like outdoor scenes being less memorable, but the AI didn't necessarily pick up on the illusory face effect as strongly. Of course, no study is perfect. The researchers point out that they used a lot of illusory face images in their experiment, which might be more than you'd see in everyday life. And they're not sure if these findings would apply to other kinds of illusions. Plus, they didn't look at the emotional content of the images, which could also play a role in memory, but the core finding is pretty fascinating. It suggests that when we encounter something that tricks our brain into seeing a face, it leaves a unique kind of trace. It biases us towards saying yes in a memory test, possibly because it feels familiar, even if we can't clearly recall the actual event. It's a reminder that our memories aren't just about what happened, but also about how our brains interpret and process those events, sometimes in surprisingly creative ways. What do you think about this? Have you ever had that weird feeling of almost remembering something that you know you've never actually experienced? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this exploration into the quirks of memory interesting, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more dives into the fascinating world of psychology. We love bringing you the stories behind the science. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.